Evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to Lancaster University and welcome to the Lancaster Environment Lecture. My name is Edward Simpson and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the university. My job is really this evening only to welcome you, to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the university on what is a warm evening. Part of my job, as I see it, is to advocate for the arts, social sciences and humanities, to put them in the centre of debate, to show their relevance, but also to engage, to bring different audiences onto our campus and to take my colleagues off campus into the world that surrounds us. I enjoy that part of my job very much. Sometimes I feel as if the arts, humanities and social sciences are under threat in a world dominated by STEM disciplines. But on evenings like this, I feel very proud and happy to be working at Lancaster University. The university puts a great deal of emphasis on sustainability and the environment within our strategic planning, but also within our day-to-day life on the campus. It's a really important value for us, and it brings us together as a community. I also like the Lancaster Environment Lecture because it's one of those events that stays with you all year. It tends to shape debate a little bit and echo through your thoughts. In the first year, we had Vandana Shiva talking about how we shouldn't trust capitalism or globalization in any straightforward form. In the second year of the lecture, we had George Monbiot telling us how we could devour things without devouring the planet. That one kept us all going for a while. My favourite part of that evening, now I'm going completely off script, was taking George out for dinner afterwards, and the Vice-Chancellor's wife, who's a very nice person, said to George, "Do you really believe what you just said?" And George said, "Yes, I do." And then last year we had Caroline Lucas, who challenged us all to think about how we would reclaim English landscape and identity from the political right. It was an argument I found so persuasive and thought-provoking that I put a book next to my desk, and it's been sitting there all year, keeping me entertained and provoked through deanly conversations. But this evening is also important for us at the university because of our partnership with Litfest. We have a number of other lectures that we partner with Litfest. It's an important connection for the university to the city, to the region, but I also hope to you, our audience, it signals our willingness to engage and to facilitate and to use some of the wonderful facilities we have as a university to allow events like this to happen in this part of the world. That's all I want to say. Bill is going to introduce the evening. I will take the opportunity of thanking Bella very much for being here. It's very nice to see you on our campus. And finally, from me, thank you all very much as our audience for being here and for making this event this evening. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. I'd also like to take the opportunity just to say that the collaboration would not work half as well without Ed's support. Now, as you know, the Lancaster Environment Lecture is a collaboration between Litfest and Lancaster University, and it's one of a growing number called the Lancaster International Lecture Series, which now has its own website under the name the Lancaster International Lecture Series, and it's on the Lancaster University website. So you can find out more about it there. We're especially grateful at Litfest to the university's 7 participating departments, or schools, as some of them are now called, for their support for this lecture. That is, and these are going to surprise some of you, not only the Environment Centre and not only the Law Department or Sociology, but English Literature, languages, and I've forgotten one. Oh, yes, and the Lancaster Institute for Contemporary Arts. All of these bodies provide a small committee that helps to find the speakers each year, and it's always a bit of a challenge, and out of it always comes something really, really interesting. Now, at a time when the public political pressure on companies to row back from sustainable energy initiatives is growing, it was heartening to read about a report published just yesterday which shows that in the last 5 years the number of European countries aligned with climate goals has grown by 20%. Now, there are plenty of people who might argue against that, including perhaps our speaker and moderator this evening. But it is a battle, and this battle for the planet's future, and therefore our future, is hanging in the balance. So it seemed to us important right now to hear from the generation of young people whose daily reality has always been the climate crisis, and whose fate will be to summon the energy and stamina to reach the climate goals that are necessary if we're going to hold the rise in temperature to something that we can all live with. And therefore, we are particularly pleased to welcome author and environmental campaigner Bella Lack. Bella has been campaigning all her life, and by the time she was 18, had already travelled to places on the front line of climate change, published her first book, this one, The Children of the Anthropocene, which she'll be signing afterwards, and made a TV documentary called Animal with Jane Goodall. Who better, then, to tell us about how things look to young people across the world? The shape of this evening will be as follows. Bella will speak for about 25 minutes. She'll be reading her lecture in the way that Caroline Lucas did last year. And then she will be joined, after a little bit of furniture shifting, by our moderator, Matt Sowerby. Now, Matt is himself an interesting writer and campaigner. He won a prize for his very well-titled essay, Hope is the Thing with Flippers. Some of you may pick up the reference not only to Emily Dickinson, but Max Porter. He's a performance poet. He's a campaigner working with an organisation called Resilience in Birmingham. And he, like Bella, is of that generation that's living with this every day. And if you are watching online, so welcome to our online audience, please put any questions you may have when we get to the Q&A part of the evening, really an extension of the conversation that Bella and Matt will have together. Please put those questions into the Q&A box on the Crowdcast screen. And if you're in the lecture theatre, please wait until the roving mic reaches you and keep your questions brief so that Bella can answer as many as possible in the time available. Now, 2 more words about Bella and Matt. Bella is a conservationist and environmental activist, as we've said, author of Children of the Anthropocene, but she's also incredibly active and done a lot already. She co-founded Reserva Youth Land Trust in 2020, which has projects in Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama. And in 2021, as I mentioned, she presented the documentary Animal with Jane Goodall, and I'm hoping she will tell us about new initiatives that I may not yet know about. And Matt, as I said, is a climate writer and activist. And the thing I wanted to just pick out was the prize he won was the International 2024 Nature Chronicles Prize. But he is also program lead at the Resilience Project, a youth-led non-profit helping young climate change makers find their peace, their power, and their people. And so, without further ado, I'm going to invite Bella to take the floor and give her lecture.
Thank you so much to Lancaster Literature Festival and Lancaster University for having me. It's an incredible honour to follow George Monbiot, Caroline Lucas, and Vandana Shiva, three people who I've followed for a long time and admired for my whole life. I would just like everyone to close their eyes whilst I begin and picture the world 4.4 degrees hotter than pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. That was one of the IPCC's 6th assessment report predictions for scenarios with either unabated emissions rise or immediate climate action. But unless you've pored over climate models and understand the intricacies of tipping points to a T, it's unlikely that you can visualize this outcome and truly imagine the severity of what's to come. Now keep your eyes closed, I see lots of peeking people, and picture Timothy. He lives with his grandchildren in Wallundi Island, a small dot off the east coast of South Malatia Island, part of the Solomon Islands. Since 2002, the 1,200 inhabitants of Wallundi have abandoned their homes and moved away from that island. Only one house remains, Timothy's. When his former neighbours are asked about Timothy, they shrug indifferently and say, "He's stubborn. He won't listen to us." Every morning, his 4 young grandchildren take the canoe to the mainland where they go to school, while Timothy spends the day adding rocks around the island to the wall around his house, trying to hold off the water for just a little bit longer. If I move to the mainland, I can't see anything through these trees. I won't even see the water. I want to have this spot where I can look around me, because I'm part of this place. His is a story that powerfully conveys the loneliness and loss that only 1.1 degrees of anthropogenic warming is already causing. Just remember his story, because I'm going to come back to Timothy later, and open your eyes as well. So on the 22nd of April, which was Earth Day, 55 years after the inaugural Earth Day, I was writing down a few notes for this lecture. The first Earth Day was triggered by an oil spill in Santa Barbara and a river which kept catching fire in Cleveland. Since the first Earth Day, the world has produced 3 times as much CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels as it had in its entire industrial history up to this point. And since that time, the world has also warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius, with the fastest warming occurring over terrestrial ecosystems, which is obviously where we all inhabit. So after millennia of stability, huge change is not just looming over us, but already permeating most of what human society is unfortunately unable to see. Humans tend to react to that which we can see, and the thin layer of molecules that makes Earth so remarkable has shifted dramatically. The amount of carbon dioxide today in the air is more than 50% higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And March 2025, as I'm sure most of you know, was the hottest March ever recorded on Earth. So the original Earth Day was looking to slow down destruction, because things may get worse. Now we're looking to reverse the damage already done, because we are the first few generations that live in this post-apocalyptic state, where we know the way that humanity may end. So my first question is, if we care, why don't we act like it? And my second question I want to answer is, if the evidence piles up, why is our response falling short or even diminishing? This is the first time in my not that long life that since I've been part of environmentalism, that I've seen awareness not just stagnating, but actually retreating. And it reminds me very much of a moment I had in 2021 in Ecuador with Reserva Youth Land Trust, an organization Callie Broadus and I founded just a few years earlier. We were camping in the Chocó Cloud rainforest on a conservation and scientific expedition, trekking through the reserve that we had spent 2 years fundraising with an international group of young people all over the world to protect, with a locally run organization called Ecominga. And this was the first time many of us had been there in person. On one of his solitary escapades, Marco, a fellow member of the Youth Council and an Ecuadorian local who knew his way around the jungle like the back of his hands, discovered a rugged trail snaking near our camp. When he returned, I was at the makeshift camp with the 5 other expedition members, and it was quite clear from his face and his mannerisms that something was wrong. After some communication and using my very little fragments of Spanish, I understood that the shard of yellow rock he held in his hand was gold and pyrite. Marco had found an illegal mining site on a protected reserve very, very close to our camp. The miners had decimated more than 3 kilometers of an ecologically significant gorge, habitat for several threatened and endangered species. And by the looks of it, they were still in the area. The tracks were fresh, and there was gold and pyrite all over the destroyed forest. So there were 4 young people there, including me, and 3 adults on the expedition. It was at that moment that we discovered that the work we had worked tirelessly to establish as a reserve over the last 2 years had been encroached on and was now being targeted by mining companies, by foreign mining companies as well. That feeling of working and pushing and striving to protect something that you care about so much, and then suddenly watching it all come crumbling down just at the unfurling of a hand, is something that lots of people around the world are seeing now. Because of the vested interests of a very narrow group of people. And it's a microcosm which we're seeing echoed in politics, in business, in youth climate activism, and far beyond. We see it in Canada. The new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, chose as his first official act the repeal of the country's landmark carbon tax. We see it in Mexico, where the climate scientist president is building fossil fuel infrastructure. We see it on our doorstep, where Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, who I'm sure lots of us are familiar with, says pursuing the 2050 net zero target, a policy introduced by her Conservative Party in 2019, would prove too costly for the British economy. And Tony Blair just a few weeks ago saying the same thing. And obviously we see it in the US, drilling in federal reserves, rolling back electric vehicle mandates, and under Trump, a full-blown revival of fossil fuel dominance. The political retreat from environmental action is also matched in business. And I know this is heavy. I promise you I'll lighten it up soon. When Bloomberg recently analysed earning calls of S&P 500 companies going back to 2020, it found that the companies talked about the environment in the first quarter of 2025 on average 76% less than they did 3 years ago. And even worse, 5 years ago, the talk was about the business opportunity of a successful transition. And these days, in analysis by the New Republic, that dialogue is about not just the not the drawbacks of a hotter world, but the opportunities of a hotter world. For example, booming air conditioning. And finally, the US think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, recently began a climate realism initiative, suggesting that the world should give up on its goals of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and instead prepare well for a brutal 3 degrees Celsius or more. The essay announcing the initiative calls the prospect of reaching net zero global emissions by 2050 utterly implausible. So this retreat from ambition, which is being called realism, is a thinly veiled example of doubling down on the profit motive. A pursuit of profit masquerading as pragmatism. It's realistic and pragmatic to assume that not revising for an exam will lead to failure, just as it's realistic and pragmatic to assume that giving up or weakening global treaties and targets will also lead to failure, except we'll have no resets. So today I want to open up a bit of a discussion, and hopefully we can make this reciprocal later, about why our planetary systems are in crisis. But even more than that, why the concept of environmentalism itself is in crisis, even being abandoned. We, and I'm assuming all of us are in a similar boat, the environmentalists or activists or at least conscious citizens or whatever we like to call ourselves, need to understand the reality of our actions better and where we can begin to find hope again. Firstly, and I'm going to cover 3 main points. Firstly, I think we need to understand that what we believe about ourselves isn't reflected in how we act. In the UK, we believe, embedded in our national consciousness and identity, that we're a nation of animal lovers, nature lovers. Our supposed love of nature is expressed from our poetry to our naturalists to our love of nature documentaries, especially David Attenborough's most recent one, and millions being members of nature conservation organisations. However, Anglia Ruskin University found just last year that we, the UK, are 59th out of 65th on connectedness to nature. 14 out of 19 of our HE targets have only been partially achieved, and they're biodiversity targets which were set in 2010. And lastly, the 2023 State of Nature report indicates that 1 in 6 species assessed in Great Britain are at risk of extinction. So why are we facing this chasm between what we say we care about and what we act on? If every parent said they loved their kids, then proceeded to do nothing about that love, there'd be an outcry. So this has been called the say-do gap, the gap between growing consumer awareness of climate change and the lack of widespread change in consumer behaviour. The say-do gap is 89% of individuals saying they care about environmental action, but when life gets in the way, not acting on any of those environmental issues. The next issue we face is the communication strategies that we use when we talk about the loss of nature and climate change. Chris Muscardi from New Zero World, who's a good friend of mine now, has called this the information deficit model, where we treat the climate challenge as a problem of people not knowing enough, and we think that the more information there is, the more likely people will act. And actually, the reverse has been proven true. As Dr. Marcus Collins, a leading expert in cultural marketing, says, people move, people buy, people consume, people act, not because of what the thing is, but because of who they are. Timothy Morton, chair in English at Rice University, calls climate change a hyper-object. Similar to an oil spill, to capitalism, to global plastic pollution or black holes, there are certain scales that the human mind just isn't built to comprehend. All these things, climate change or the loss of a species, tend to be immense, structural, and when we try to understand them, we experience something called psychological numbing. If I tell you about my dog dying, you'll feel empathy and sadness for my loss maybe. But you can't feel empathy and sadness for every dog and death in the world, or you'll be in a constant state of despair and overwhelm. A story about an individual victim speaks to our heart, but a dry statistic about millions doesn't. People act when they feel like they can really do something about it. And that's the core of the issue, efficacy. We don't hear information and then rationalize it and then act. Chris DeMeyer, the well-known climate neuroscientist, argues that gut feeling, instinct, and intuition come first. Then we follow up with a little press secretary in our brain whose job it is to defend ourselves, our reputation, and the tribes that surround us. Beliefs come before actions. For example, look at someone buying an electric car. For some people, there's an intuitive gut feeling of, electric cars aren't for me. It feels too risky, too expensive, too unfamiliar. It's for rich liberals. Then the press secretary part of the brain comes in to defend that intuition by rationalizing reasons that sound credible to themselves and others. Lithium mining is terrible for the environment. The upfront cost is too high. Battery disposal is a nightmare. Therefore, convincing people to act, really act, rather than be part of the silent majority who know we must do something, but never actually do that thing, means looking objectively at some of the greatest convincers of this era, who all use the same basic framework. And it's a framework that's been spoken about in a previous Lancaster environment lecture by George Monbiot. And he calls this the restoration story. It goes like this. The world is thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humanity. Heroes rise up against those powerful and nefarious forces, and despite the odds, defeat them. We see it in the Bible, in Harry Potter, in Lord of the Rings, and as a repetitively, overwhelmingly political story on both the left and the right. We see it when Trump says, "Make America great again," the Brexit story promising they'd take back control. And why do these stories work? Research from a multitude of fields suggests that story structures match human neural networks. What do a mother breastfeeding, a hug, and from a friend, and a story all have in common? They release oxytocin, known as the love drug. And it's powerful. In a study by neuroscientist Paul Zak, participants who were given synthetic oxytocin donated 57% more to charity. Similarly, hearing information in narrative form results in a higher likelihood of social behavior. So stories make us more empathetic and more receptive to change. In 2005, the International Rice Research Institute used a radio soap opera called Homeland Story to persuade millions of rice farmers in Vietnam to stop spraying their crops with a harmful insecticide. Farmers who listened to the story were 31% less likely to spray the crops than those simply told not to. Similarly, in 2017, a gruesome video detailing the rescue and return of a sea turtle with a plastic straw stuck in its nose went viral, and the city of Seattle, Washington, British Prime Minister Theresa May, and multiple airlines and companies banned plastic straws just from that one story. So far, I've labelled two issues: the say-do gap and the communication crisis. And the third, final, and possibly most important of all, is the increasing feeling of powerlessness and disillusionment I've seen among young people. Channel 4 recently released a study saying that 52% of those 13 to 27 want a strong leader or a dictator. And there's been a 10% decline in youth voting over the last 5 years. And the reaction to this shouldn't be, why don't young people engage? I think we need to flip that around and ask instead, how have we made it hard for them to engage? It's because I believe they're disillusioned with the world, the routine meaningless of politics, because it's riddled with 1, mistruths, and 2, unrepresentative of young people. Recent examples are, for example, Rachel Reeves claiming that we haven't had a runway built in Britain since the 1940s, despite there being one in Manchester in 2001, and several plans since then. More likely a lack of research than a lie, but still, when deceit in public life doesn't carry any real consequences and is allowed to be put on public government websites, trust is eroded in the systems supposedly built to represent us. If change is to happen at the policy level, we need citizens who care, challenging and deliberating at that level too. So the same Guardian researchers who I mentioned earlier, who found that 89% of people want more climate action, conducted another study where they brought in participants, gave them each a pot of $450 and asked, how much would you give to a charity that cuts carbon emissions by investing in renewable energy? And how much would you keep for yourself? Real money was handed out to randomly chosen participants, so there was weight behind their decisions. The average person gave away about half the money and kept the rest. But those told beforehand that the vast majority of other people in the study believe climate action is important boosted the donations by $16 per person. So if you believe others care, you care more. The problem is, those same participants underestimated the actions others would take compared to themselves. We operate in our own bubbles, believing we're inherently smarter, more altruistic, and far less lazy than others, because we know what we could do if we wanted to, compared to what others actually do. Therefore, one of the biggest challenges is the echo chambers that we operate in, which means we're unaware of how many other people really care, especially if they're not doing something about it. So drawing these three factors together, we have 1, the say-do gap, 2, the communication crisis, and 3, the feeling of powerlessness and disillusionment I've seen among young people, which has also extended out to all generations. So how do we move forward? I think we need to start to completely rethink what environmentalism looks like. Talking about environmentalism needs to become more of a verb, an action-based concept rather than an issue-based concept. When you're teaching someone to ride a bike, you don't sit them down and explain it to them. You may show them first by riding yourself, and then you put them on the bike, and they learn through the trial and error of pedaling and falling and getting back up and pedaling again. So we need to act ourselves and talk to others about those who are taking action. So to practice what I preach, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. Because there are 2 options that we're usually given for action: consumer choice and climate activism. And I've met so many people who are taking action that extends beyond those 2 options. So the first is a story about a young woman called Belinda Riccomani. So remember Timothy, the man I introduced you to at the beginning in the Solomon Islands? I knew about him because in 2020 I interviewed Belinda Riccomani for the book. At the time, she was a law student, and she'd grown up in the Solomon Islands, a nation of hundreds of islands in the South Pacific. Her province would fulfill an average European's definition of paradise: fine powder beaches, sighing blue seas, lapping at the roots of palm trees. However, a small section in the 2018 IPCC report on 1.5 degrees warming undermines this illusion, warning that without drastic emissions cuts, Pacific Island nations will simply disappear. I was interviewing Belinda, asking her about the Pacific Island students fighting climate change and their core campaign, which she started herself alongside 26 other students from the University of the South Pacific, and which has now culminated in the most significant climate case before the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court. It looks at state obligations to develop international law, create legal obligations around environmental treaties and basic human rights, and clarify state responsibilities for climate harm. As a result of this campaign, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution in 2023 asking the ICJ to clarify states' legal obligations to protect the climate. The court must determine the consequences of state inaction or environmental harm, particularly in relation to those affected, small island nations and future generations. Right now, the ICJ is in the deliberation phase and will deliver its response later this year. And the ruling will just be an advisory opinion, not a binding judgment. But the advisory opinions of the ICJ have historically transformed the landscape of legal norms. In 1966, the ICJ deliberated and issued its advisory opinion on nuclear weapons. Even though the opinion wasn't legally binding, it set a global baseline on thinking around nuclear disarmament and led to a strengthened resolve and treaties such as the 2017 Non-Proliferation Treaty on Nuclear Weapons. So law holds cultural authority, and in a moment when lots of my generation are looking around frantically and confusedly for an authority figure, vying for social order in a world that seems increasingly disordered, we should find ways for law and the political system, rather than an autocratic dictator not naming any names, to become that voice we look to for collective reason, which is exactly what Belinda did, just by gathering a group and a community around her based on their shared degree of law. The second story is a bit closer to home. In 2019, when I was 16, my friend Callie Broadus and I were desperate to do something for conservation. We saw the burgeoning climate movement, the climate strikes, and recognized how underlooked global nature was in the environmental movement. We thought that since we were both defined as youth and we wanted to protect nature reserves, youth, by the way, is defined as under 27, I think, in the UN, so it's quite a broad category, and wanted to protect nature reserves, we should set up an organization that empowered young people to protect the first fully youth-driven network of reserves around the world, working with a local organization on each respective reserve. And Reserve of the Youth Land Trust is now a 501c, a youth-led non-profit working internationally to help create and support protected areas in biodiversity hotspots. Since 2019, we've had more than 6,000 young people, 26 and under, participating in our programs and protected almost 2,500 acres of cloud forest in Ecuador, including the 1,000-acre cloud forest site that I mentioned earlier, threatened by mining interests. So our Youth Council have gone on expeditions in Ecuador to conduct field work, assisted our partners in Panama to deploy satellite tags on nesting sea turtles in the Pearl Islands. And finally, we've just begun work on a new reserve in Colombia, where there's a population of Caqueta tiki monkeys in the foothills of Piemonte. And there are fewer than 500 adult Caqueta tiki monkeys left, but the reserve has just been established, and hopefully I can come back to you with good news in the next few weeks. So what can be seen as a disadvantage financially and in terms of having a voice, which is being a young person, became our greatest strength in organising this community of people who wanted to do something for conservation. And the third story is about place and community. That factor of similarity doesn't just have to be career or identity or passion. It can also be place-based, engaging with those right next to you. In 2019, when I was working on Animal, we were investigating solutions to the 6th mass extinction, and we met this man in India called Afroz Shah, who was a young lawyer from Mumbai who orchestrated the world's biggest beach cleanup on one of the world's most polluted beaches called Versova Beach. He explained to us that being a lawyer your first instinct is to go and complain. And that would have been an easy journey for me. But the responsibility was mine. I started to look at how I had helped to destroy the oceans and how I could rectify that. So I started cleaning. It began with Vasova Beach, where I'd grown up. I sat down with my neighbour, sitting by the window, overlooking what was now one of the most polluted beaches in the world. And I said to him, this was Afros, not me, I'm going to clean this beach. Will you join me? He looked at me like a bubbly teenager and said, yes, Afros, I'll join you. So in 2015, in October, Afros and Harbonash walked down to that beach, armed with just a pair of gloves and a few bags, and they picked up 5 bags of plastic. Painstakingly, they removed every single bit of rubbish that they saw, piece by piece, every single weekend. And the cleanups quickly grew into a global movement. Within the first 3 years, they had gathered a community and picked up more than 5 million kilograms of rubbish. Then in 2018, on a muggy morning, when the waves boomed and pounded against the sand, something happened which hadn't happened in more than 2 decades. The hatching of almost 80 olive ridley turtles. 80 little faces punctured 80 eggs, and 160 small flippers scraped and scrambled towards the sea. It was a small moment, but to Afros and to that whole community, symbolic of so much more. After Vasova Beach, Afros began clearing plastic from a local police station, and then they moved to a forest, and along with his team, they decided to tackle the Mithi River, which meanders through the very heart of Mumbai. 2 million people live on the banks of that river, and it's piled high with rubbish, much of which is swept into the ocean, and they're still working on that river today. It would be ignorant of me to assume I can just stand here and give each of you a silver bullet solution, especially because I know that all of you here are already embedded in environmentalism in your own ways. In The New Yorker, Andrew Moratz wrote that in horror movies, there is an abrupt, cataclysmic tremor, a deafening roar. In the real world, though, the cataclysm can come in on little cat feet. The tremors can be so muffled and distant that people continually adapt, explaining away the anomalies like a frog in boiling water. In a landscape where it's increasingly easy to become oversaturated and overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges we face, confronting us in the wider world, we need to fall in love with the creativity and the power of the solutions that exist. Afros did it on Vasova Beach. All the young people at Reserva have done it just because of their love of nature. Belinda has done it with her fellow law students. So instead of unifying us by telling us all one thing that we can do, I want to unify us by doubling down on all of our differences. It's when we begin to understand our niche and our community and our own skill set, it's then that we can avoid being that frog, unaware of how much the environment around us is changing. Thank you very much, and I think Matt and I are going to have a bit of a chat.
That was such a clear-sighted and empowering analysis, I think, of the situation that we're in. I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the variety of emotions, sometimes difficult emotions, that are going to be in this room right now, in this audience, as a response to that. Also, maybe just in the room anyway. So right now, I know that at various points in that talk, I was feeling anxiety, guilt, overwhelm, anger, protectiveness, denial, panic, confusion. I think there was some hope in there. A lot of curiosity, also hungry for a lot of it. I just wanted to, I guess, acknowledge that emotional biodiversity, that richness of feeling. I spend my days working for a charity that supports young people who feel difficult emotions about climate change. And a lot of the time, day to day, what they're actually worried about isn't like the state of the world. It's the fact that the people around them don't seem to be worried about the state of the world. don't seem to get it. And I feel really lucky right now to be in a room full of people that do get it. So thank you everyone for being here today for this. For the next 15 minutes, we're just going to have a bit of a chat around about some of the things that you were talking about, and then there's going to be a Q&A. It's going to be a 20-minute Q&A. I think that's quite long, but I think you're an audience with lots of questions. And if you're not, then this is your 20-minute warning to start thinking about questions. Bella, we didn't get your origin story, but you've been doing this for absolutely ages.
Feels like it.
Yeah, since you were like 12?
Yeah,
like that?
About 12. Yeah.
So what was it like to come of age, not just in a climate crisis, but also like in the public eye, in the climate movement?
I wouldn't say public eye at all. This is probably the most public I've been for a long time. But for me, I began because I really, really loved orangutans. And it started just because I watched a video about palm oil and the effect of palm oil on orangutans. And then for sort of the first few years when I was taking action, it was just driven by that desire to do something around palm oil, which turns out I was completely wrong. And I learned not to be dogmatic because palm oil is actually a lot more sustainable than other forms of oil. But anyways, that for the first few years, it was completely driven by a passion and a love to protect the natural world. And then there were a few years during the climate strike when I think everyone felt overwhelmed by the scale of what we have to do. And especially I saw young people who hadn't been aware of what was happening. Suddenly there was this, what's the opposite of exodus? There was this migration into the environmental sphere and everyone was becoming overwhelmed. There was a lot of what's now called eco-anxiety. And now I think I've got back to a place where I'm working with Reserva and a lot of other young people who really, really love what they do. And they're driven by this vision of a wilder world or a rewilded world. And to me, that's exciting. I mean, that's a lot more exciting than just railing against and pushing against something. So I want to sort of stay focused on this vision of how much better the world can be.
Yeah, fighting for something as well as against something. We should talk about the book, The Children of the Anthropocene. What is it and what is an Anthropocene?
So I'll give you the scientific definition of Anthropocene, which was devised by this subcommission, let me get this right, subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy. Please correct me if that's wrong. They came up with it in 2000. And then 9 people on this panel voted against it and 4 voted for this new epoch being called the Anthropocene. So it's actually not the Anthropocene, we're still in the Holocene. But the Anthropocene is the fact that humans have completely modified the top strata of the layer on Earth. And you can see it in the fact that 70% of plant genetic diversity has been lost in the last century. We can see it in the fact that 96% of mammals on Earth are humans and domesticated species. So sort of without a doubt, we are living in the Anthropocene, and it may not scientifically be called that, but the evidence, the fact that some of our greatest legacies may be a disposable coffee cup that we use, that may be the last thing of us that remains. I think that's sort of testament to the fact that we are living in the Anthropocene. But it's still up for debate, so if anyone has another name, come and speak to us.
We can maybe get into that in the Q&A.
Yeah.
I guess I sort of think of it as like we've stopped adapting to the environment and now we're adapting the environment to what we're doing. Is that sort of...
Yeah. What do you say that we live in the Anthropocene?
So there's a big debate around it. Like lots of academics like coming up with words. And there was this hype around Anthropocene, and then everyone else started saying, no, capitalism is the problem, we should call it the capitalism-ocene. And I think I found a website where there was like 100 different suggested names, which are all kind of just saying the situation now is not the same as what the situation used to be, I think. And in some cases, I think it can be useful, but I guess it also, the criticism that sometimes gets made is that it lumps all humans together, right? But it's something that you talk about a lot in the book is that environmental problems, it's not humans that cause it, it's specific humans in specific places, and then other humans deal with the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of the Capitalocene, which is the idea that the environmental crisis has been caused by our economic system, not by humanity as a whole, is interesting because I've been living in France for the last sort of 7 months studying, and they call this era the Capitalocene a lot more than we do. And I'm not sure why we have such a different cultural attitude to the French in the UK, but it's just interesting that's not what we say.
Yeah, no, it's different. That's really interesting. I didn't know that it was more common over there.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm still kind of struck by this thing that you were talking about in your speech, which I feel like I've never really heard many people kind of say out loud. Maybe I've noticed it a lot on my phone, but the fact that we are now in a time where things feel like they're going backwards. You know, like there was a moment where there was so much optimism in the climate movement, and that doesn't feel like where we are anymore. But at the same time, that felt kind of almost good to hear you say that, because it was from a place not of like, oh, we're all screwed, but it was actually like, okay, let's make a strategy. Let's think about what we can do.
Yeah. I think... Sorry, was that my question? I just took that and... I think there's a man lots of you, I'm sure, will know, called John Alexander, who talks about this idea, which is that there's this increasing disillusionment because we've been told to see ourselves as consumers. So we really got riled up by this idea that what we need to do is stop consuming, or we need to consume less of things. And now people have sort of realized actually that hasn't really made any difference. And even Patagonia, who's known as this epitome of sustainability, said to us, they produced an ad saying, "Don't buy this jacket." And everyone congratulated them. It was all over social media. And then what happened? Nothing changed. And then so John Alexander says there are 3 sort of epochs of humanity, which is the era of the strong man, and then there's the era of the consumer, where we're told that we're either consumers, we consume, or we consume less. And he wants to create a new era, which is the era of the citizen, where we begin to see ourselves as citizens, and we begin to create new forms of civic engagement and democratic engagement. And it's something that's sort of, the solutions don't really exist yet, but that conversation has been opened up. And lots of places in Paris, they've created really successful citizens' assemblies, where the policies that the 50 members of that citizen assemblies came up with were predicted to reduce emissions by 40% more than the current policies of the French government. And we had a not so successful citizens' assembly, I think in 2019 or 2020 in the UK, just after we declared a climate emergency. But, you know, democracy is a muscle, and sort of having those first instances of citizens' assemblies is the start to new forms of participation, and not just seeing ourselves as we need to consume less, we need to sacrifice everything. Actually, there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot of places that people can be more engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been told that maybe your microphone's not working very well. So
oh, sorry. I have quite a weedy voice, I think. So.
Okay. I can hear you from here, if that's any consolation. So on that then, I guess in terms of what can people do, your takeaway in your lecture, it felt like it was really about, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but like rooting your action, what you're going to do within like your strengths, rather than just being like, oh, okay, I need to be a Just Stop Oil person, or I need to do stuff with my consumer decisions, but actually like figuring out what's the right thing for you.
Yeah.
How's that going?
I'm still learning, definitely. But I just found when I was doing more conventional activism, I found it wasn't something I was that good at, really. And I think lots of people have struggled with this exclusionary, you're an activist or you're not an activist. And I think, I talked about it in the talk, but I think we need to bring new forms of activism. And actually, the Oxford Dictionary defines activism as any form of action which instigates social change. So it doesn't have to just be in the form of protest. And what you see with Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, that's sort of the more radical flank, which shifts the Overton window of what's acceptable. And then we have forms of action at every other layer of society that we need. So I think we need to move away from this idea of there just being one form of environmentalism and then everyone else is sort of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
But you've found your own niche as well in poetry, which is more successfully than I found my niche, I think.
I don't know. I feel like, I stick to the stuff that I'm good at and also to the stuff that I enjoy. Like if I found a way of making change, if I tried to become like an economist for the planet, I would be very bad at that, and also I would hate it. And so it feels to me really important that if you're going to start becoming a change maker, if you're going to start doing something, that you make it something that you like, because you're going to spend a lot of time doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think that's relevant.
Sorry.
Do you want mine as well? Like?
Am I meant to use them both? Or?
You mentioned to me earlier that at the moment you're writing a lot more about young people in politics and trying to overcome some of the issues that you mentioned about young people becoming illusioned in politics. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's just because there was a big this big burgeoning movement in 2019 and 2020, and I'm just speaking. Not just speaking environmentally, there were lots of other social movements with Black Lives Matter, and I think it was also partly because of lockdown, people were connected in ways that we hadn't been before. And then fast forward to now, a few years later, and we haven't seen any of those demands sort of reflected in the political system. And I think with young people we have, because we've been brought up with social media, there's sort of been this embedded I want to say entitlement to be included in every discussion and to have our voices heard, which, can be seen as a bad thing, but I think because of the issues we face right now, it can also be seen as a really good thing that young people feel like their voices need to be heard. We just need to find ways or forums for those discussions to be had. And once again, this is something I'd love to discuss with everyone, because I don't think they exist and I don't know what the solutions are except citizens' assemblies. And the latest CAN bill, which Labour promised to bring in, which is a climate and nature bill, had citizens' assemblies as its main point and was shut down basically as soon as Labour got into government, despite it being one of the greatest environmental promises that they'd promised to bring in. So I actually forgot what I was talking about. But
no, that was great. I think you've done it. We're going to move to questions from the audience. Is Helen around? Helen's going to be running around with a microphone. So just a reminder that questions and statements are different things. Questions normally end with question marks. They normally start with words like who, what, where, when, how, and why. And please wait until the microphone reaches you. We have a big online audience, so it would be great if they could hear you and hear your question as well. Does anyone want to kick us off? Over here, maybe.
Hi, thanks, Bill. I think it was a really good talk. Definitely very inspirational and a lot to think about. But I was just really interested in that last point that you made about kind of the rise, or you felt decline in youth activism, just because I'm actually personally observing and participating in what I see as a huge movement in youth activism around solidarity with Palestine. And I think part of the reason why it seems that there's been kind of a decline in activism around the climate crisis is a lot of those efforts have kind of shifted, just because this is such an urgent human rights and arguably and kind of undeniably also environmental issue. So yeah, I don't know, I think you can really see, especially at universities around the UK and in the US, the fact that there is a lot of activism going on there. So yeah, I guess, do you think that it's just people not caring, or do you think that it is also somewhat related to people kind of also dealing with other super urgent social issues?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a combination of both, but I think even in terms of social protests and the Palestine protests, and I mean social and environmental are sort of intrinsically linked. I have seen this increase in disillusionment, and even exclusively with the Palestine protests, I seen on my campus, I think, a drop-off in engagement around that, because people don't feel like any of the demands that they're making are being listened to, their voices are being heard. And I mean, I won't speak extensively to that because it's not, but I agree with you that there have been other issues which have arisen. Yeah. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. As my day job, I'm working a lot with activists, and I definitely see that Palestine is the issue right now, that people are like gathering around and protesting around, and maybe that's just where momentum has moved. At the same time, like across Europe, young people are voting less, right? Maybe further afield. I think that both are true, like that, absolutely. But also, yeah, I think there is also generally outside of activist circles, there is a disillusionment with politics and a feeling that young people have that their decisions, we're moving to the extremes, rather very, very active or we're very, very not, I think. Anyone else? Let's go over here. Is there one over there? Yes, here. Okay.
Hi, thank you. Yes, reiterate all that about amazing talk. You also, in a lot of moments, you refer back to policy and lawmaking and changing the way, and the disillusionment in politics, of course. And I'm just wondering if, for me personally, I think a lot of that disillusionment comes from this idea that the way the system is set up is not designed for these changes in the first place. I'm sure you can attest to that. And a lot of the way laws exist is to protect property and to protect capital and protect these things which didn't quite have space. And the fact that they're also country locked, and it doesn't make sense that for such a global issue, countries are working individually. So on this idea of like participatory, do you see in your work, and you mentioned how networks are becoming international, how can we start bringing that level of international action into politics itself? Because I think it's necessary for...
Yeah. Well, just to what you were saying about the resistance coming from sort of the legal political systems towards people taking action, I think there have been lots of international changes which are then being applied at local levels. And one of the best examples is the right to a healthy environment, which was brought forward by David Boyd, who's a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. And he was with the UN from 2018 to 2024. And he realised that environmental law wasn't sufficient, and we can see it in COPs. Emissions have been rising despite increasing sort of frameworks produced by these COPs. And he realised that what people needed was a human right to a healthy environment rather than just environmental law. And people have been taking this human right and then suing their governments using this new mechanism. And it's also happened with nature's rights. And one of the people that we worked with at Reserva, called Callie Whelan-Turf, used this international sort of ideological framework of nature rights, and she pushed it through the Panamanian Constitution in 2023. And now they've used that new concept of nature's rights in the Constitution to ban a new mine just last year. So I think we do have these international frameworks which are then being applied at local levels. And I mean, it's the same in politics. We need to have these international frameworks which then people can apply to their own democracies and to their own communities as well. Do you want to add something?
No notes.
Okay.
Oh my God. Okay, question over here.
Okay. Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really great. I was really connecting to what you said about the options for young people around taking action, and it kind of sits around either consumer choice or writing to your MP.
Yeah.
And I lead the Morecambe Bay curriculum, which is the environmental kind of movement in this area, but also co-chair the Energy Saving Trust Foundation. And the thing we're really interested in is how do we support young people who are facing intersectional disadvantage to access climate action. And I just wondered if either of you could reflect on what are the best programmes you've seen for young people that really meet them where they are. Thank you.
Want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I often like to think about at the start, like, why young people? Why? Because at the end of the day, like, a lot of the people that in schools, I think a lot of climate interventions are happening in schools. But by the time that those young people are in positions of power, we might have passed the tipping points where they're able to make change. That's a really sad fact. And so part of me is like, well, why are we defaulting to being like, oh, the kids will save us? In terms of like how to do it well, because there's another part of my brain that's saying, oh, they will influence their parents, etc., etc. The kid can be the undercover environmentalist in the household. I think thinking about the emotional implications of bringing in a conversation like climate, which has to be done, but like how can we build support around that? Focusing on like the what can be done, the positives, the actions, rather than just the kids. I think like when a problem has solutions, and luckily climate change is a problem with a lot of solutions. So it's I think highlighting that as well. And then intersectionality, the way that all of these issues are connected. You know, climate isn't this like big, vague thing. It's also, it links to every other problem in our lives. And so it can be made personal in all of these different ways as well. It touches all of us.
I think one of the best ways I would say is letting young people take the sort of steering wheel and be at the helm of making that change. And it just comes down to providing access to organisations. So, for example, Stop Ecocide, who are quite an established legal organisation working to push the motion of ecocide through the IUCN, have just created a youth branch, which is completely governed by sort of a youth panel and a youth board. And then they have discussions together, but they operate independently. And I mean, I don't think that the space just needs to be provided. And so Ella Kesey Deborah, who was the first death, she was 8, I believe, the first death to be classified as a result of air pollution. Her friends started up an organisation to look at air pollution in London and the illegal levels of air pollution in London, and the fact that that results in 8 million deaths globally every year. And they began that and looking at the intersectionality between air pollution and communities of colour, and that began because her friends recognised that they needed to do something, and the space was given. I think they worked with her mum and Change.org, but the space was given to them they had a passion, and the space was given, not to repeat myself again and again, but I think it's to provide that sort of forum and access to resources, and then, you know, let young people hit the ground running. All of us are new in this fight against the environmental crisis because we have new reports coming out every day which are both positive and negative. And as Bill mentioned earlier, there was a new one yesterday about what companies are doing positively in response to the climate crisis, which sort of juxtaposes exactly what I spoke about in my talk. So none of us can be experts in the way we are in different fields.
Yeah. Let's do a question down here, and then maybe we can go to the online questions. Great.
Thank you for that brilliant and really inspiring talk. Last night was the inaugural Climate Fiction Prize, and that's been brought together by a group of young people, which is brilliant, and it's now organised by a group called Climate Spring, who commission film, TV, and now run the prize. And at the heart of their challenge is the problem of dystopian fiction and how much foreground to give to that. So last night's winner, And So I Roar, has dystopian elements within it. So is that a victory for literature or a failure of the prize?
Can I ask what the dystopian, what it was, the fiction?
So it's a novel called And So I Roar. I have to confess I haven't read it yet, I will do. But she is writing a novel in which there is a dystopian climate future.
I don't think it's a win. I mean, for the author, I'm sure. But then again, if you look at Kim Stanley Robinson, he wrote a dystopian fiction, which sort of turned into a utopian fiction and did sort of scare people and then managed to mobilize them. And I know people have taken his idea of a carbon coin, and there's a man called Delton Chen who's taking that idea of a carbon coin, and he's trying to spread it globally, where we have this new currency. So I don't know. I think it's both a win and a loss, because we don't want to be entering any dystopia. Do you want to answer?
Please. Has anyone read Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler? So Parable of the Sower was quite an early climate fiction. It was very dystopian. It's set in America and follows in the context of kind of society breaking down. And then within that, you've got this main character who decides that she wants to found a religion. And that religion is as simple as everything that you touch, you change. Everything that you change, everything that you change changes you as well. And really what it was a philosophy of things are changing and we've got to look out for each other in that. And that has become a philosophy of real support groups and mutual aid groups around the world in the face of climate change. And so that to me is powerful, that within dystopian narratives there can also be pockets of utopia, that there can be, lessons learned. I also think there's an issue with dystopia that sometimes in the West we look at poorer countries to be like, oh, that's an interesting plot, let's just take that. And that's, I think, problematic in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about dystopia.